Hey folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my booktube channel. I saw this really interesting video by the book Leo in which she hypothesizes that people are starting to see or are about to start to see reading as an unintellectual pursuit because it is starting to be so associated in pop culture and particularly in online culture with women. And traditionally, hobbies and activities that are dominated by women tend to be considered less valuable, less prestigious, less intellectual. The book Leo talks about the way that professions like teachers and nurses used to be male-dominated and professional and respected and highly paid positions, and that as they came to be dominated by women, they became sort of semi-professionalized and the salaries went down despite needing, a high level of skill and experience and education to do them, that the association of those things with women sort of devalued them in the culture. And she hypothesizes that a similar thing is in the process of happening with reading. That if you go online and look at, YouTube videos by people talking about books, they are overwhelmingly made by women, and that the viewership for those videos is overwhelmingly women. I'm a tiny little channel, but I can say at least my viewership is overwhelmingly women. And the book Leo hypothesizes that that is causing what I think a lot of people online have been observing, which is a trend towards anti-intellectualism in the book community. And I've seen a lot of different things sort of to blame for this. Some people blame the sort of TikTok effect, and some people blame the idea of like a reader sort of becoming an identity as opposed to just a hobby. I think there are a lot of things going on, and I think the sort of factors that the book Leo identified are really interesting and plausible as contributing factors to this phenomenon. But I also think that there is something else going on. When we have this conversation about books becoming anti-intellectual, or reading becoming anti-intellectual, one of the things that always strikes me is that it is very specific to the type of book. People are always talking about novels and fiction, in particular, fantasy romance fiction, but fiction more broadly, as the kind of reading that is becoming anti-intellectual. I never see this conversation if you're talking about like military biographies, right? And that is interesting to me because the novel has always been a feminine pursuit. Sally Rooney recently wrote a very interesting article in the Paris Review talking about the history of the novel, and in particular, the sort of gender history of the novel. The article is actually titled Misreading Ulysses, but one of the big themes of it is the impact of gender on the perception society has of the novel. In the article, she says, "The novel in English has always had a curious relationship with gender. It was in the late 17th and early 18th centuries that this new form of storytelling started to develop. Relatively long prose narratives, set mostly in the present day, populated by fictional characters whose romantic lives made up the basis of the plot. These stories were sufficiently new and different from existing forms of popular literature at the time that they started to be called by the simple word novel. Formally, these books sketched out the parameters of a new genre of storytelling, incorporating narrative techniques like epistolary changes that would be crucial to the novel's later development. Thematically, their concerns were with gender, status, and sexual morality. These were the earliest stories to be described as novels in English, and they were primarily written by women. Male writers like Daniel Defoe, Henry Felding, and Samuel Richardson drew deeply on the themes and stylistic techniques of the early female novelists, sometimes while openly disparaging their work. Richardson described his novel Pamela as a new species of writing, which, dismissing the improbable and marvelous with which novels generally abound, might promote the cause of religion and virtue. Because the term novel had been coined to describe the work of women, Richardson tried to frame Pamela as something else, a new species, an attempt to differentiate his supposedly virtuous book from the immoral novels with which it ran the risk of being associated. I thought this was a really interesting backdrop against which to think about novels and gender and status. The kind of novels that I think get the most hate online for being anti-intellectual or driving people in the direction of anti-intellectualism are like fairy smut, right? And those are the height of marvelous and improbable novels focused on relationships and sexuality that one might think do not promote virtue. And so I think this phenomenon of people thinking of the novel as a thing women do and a sort of dubious thing that women do is not new. And in fact, if you think about the history of the novel, I think the work often cited as the first novel is a Japanese epic called The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the 11th century. So basically, the first ever novel was written by a woman. And if you think about the mother of the modern novel, obviously that's Jane Austen. And moving into modern times, I know that she is a controversial figure, and for good reason, and I do not say this to promote her work, but far and away, without question, the most successful novelist of the modern era is a woman. In her video, The Book Leo, she notes that people generally in society are reading less fiction and that men read even less fiction than women. But some of the research that I've seen actually suggests that that difference between the amount of men and women that read fiction, even as the overall amount of fiction society reads declines, that gap is holding stable. According to an article that I found online that I think is the article that The Book Leo is looking at in her video, fiction readership for both men and women has decreased substantially in the past decade. So the article looks at the period 2012 to 2022. And it shows that in 2012, 54.6% of women, compared to 35.1% of men, were reading novels or short stories. By 2022, those percentages had declined to 46.9% for women and 27.7% for men. So men are reading a lot less fiction than women, and both men and women are reading a lot less fiction than they did a decade ago. But the gap between men and women in terms of how much fiction, in terms of how many of them are reading fiction, has held relatively steady over the period at 20 percentage points. All of that is to say, I think the anti-intellectualism trend is not something that is happening because of a shift in reading towards being a woman-dominated pursuit. I think that it is something that is happening within reading as a woman-dominated pursuit, because reading has been a woman-dominated pursuit for a very long time. And this anti-intellectualism trend, I think, is new. So now you might be thinking, okay, Allison, if it's not gender, what's driving it? And I think there are two things. One is specific to the online book community, and that is a consumerism phenomenon that's happening. And the other is not specific to the online book community, and that is a general anti-intellectualism trend that is happening in the culture more broadly. When we talk about intellectualism and snobbery in the book community, there are two kinds of class, social class, that I think are implicated. One is class in the sort of amorphous aesthetic social sense, like if your parents are preppies and they take you to museums or you summer in Cape Cod. And the other is class in the more Marxist financial sense, which is, do you work for a living or do you live off of a passive income from inherited investments or land ownership? And I think at the intersection of those two kinds of class is a consumerism phenomenon that we are seeing in all sorts of different online communities, the makeup community, the fashion community, the home decor community, and now more recently in the online book community. There's a really interesting clip of Sally Rooney talking about the way that Connell in Normal People perceives the use of literature as a class marker that I'm gonna play now because I think it's really interesting.
There's a scene in the second novel where Connell, one of the protagonists, goes to a literary reading and he feels incredibly alienated from what he sees. He feels that writers turn up to events full of people from a particular class with a particular educational background, and essentially the writer sells them the product, which is cultured existence in the form of a commodity, and the commodity is a book. And people can purchase this book and therefore purchase their way into a seemingly cultured class. And that all of the money that changes hands in the book industry is actually just people paying to belong to a class of people who read books. And that is something that I definitely worry about and feel implicated in.
And this idea of literature as a class status symbol is not new. I mean, in old-timey portraits, you see people standing in front of bookshelves to show that they're rich and they can afford an education and they can afford to own all these books in their big fancy house. And you see that same phenomenon replicated now in Instagram photos of Emma Chamberlain lying on a yacht reading a book, or Kendall Jenner doing this like weird display of books out on the bench in front of her bed to show that she's a reader in her Architectural Digest home tour. Reading serves a sort of class function in the social sense, right? Having a, tote bag from the Strand is similar to dressing in an old money, quiet luxury aesthetic, right? It is a sort of easy way, relatively easy way, for people who are not necessarily upper class in the Marxist sense, right? People who work for a living, who have to work for a living, to show that they belong to a certain social class. But reading can also indicate that someone belongs to the financial class, that we think of as the upper class. And that is because books, along with having to buy them, you also have to read them and understand them. And we live in a consumerism culture where stuff is actually really cheap. The real markers of actual wealth in our society today are things like free time and education. The job of being an online content creator, right? And I mean this really for people who do it as a job, is functionally a marketing job, right? You are selling usually stuff, and you're doing it through projecting an image of the kind of person who has this stuff that someone watching your video or looking at your pictures might want to be. Basically, there are like three classes of people at play in the influencer marketing setup, right? One is really rich people who live a particular lifestyle that is aspirational and that other people want. And on the other end are all the people who are looking at that lifestyle and wanting it, right? And in the middle are content creators who market that lifestyle, the lifestyle of the actual genuine rich people, to consumers. But the influencers in that middle bracket are themselves usually not part of this actual upper echelon of people, financially speaking. Now, sometimes they are, there's a sort of Nepo babies thing happening in the influencer world, obviously. And so there are lots of influencers who become influencers because they're already super rich. But lots of people are influencers being given free stuff that they couldn't actually afford in their everyday life, right? And they are projecting the image of being the kind of person who buys this stuff and has this stuff, to sell that lifestyle to consumers. But they're in the middle. They're not actually part of this, financial upper class. And so a lot of the things that are the most indicative of genuine wealth, right? And I think in the book, as it relates to books, particularly this is time and education, influencers may not have those things, right? I think, it is often very clear when an influencer does have a fancy education, because they will usually put it in sort of bold as part of the marketing of their channel. And that makes total sense, because obviously it is a very effective marketing tool to be able to sell that aspect of yourself. But a lot of influencers, the vast majority of influencers don't have Oxford master's student in their bio. And I kind of think if they were Oxford master's students, they would, right? Because it's such a valuable piece of branding. And very similarly, reading books takes a ton of time. Unlike somebody who is an influencer doing this sort of marketing job in the makeup space, right, or the clothing space, where it's very easy for a brand to send you clothing and for you to then put it on camera and look cool in it, and no one is out there saying, oh my gosh, are you actually wearing this clothing? Because there's sort of no reason why anyone would doubt that you are. But reading doesn't work quite that same way. It is easy for a publisher to ship you a book or ship you an arc, right? But it is much more difficult if you are just a normal person who works a job and doesn't actually spend all of their free time, lolling around on yachts reading their book, to find the time to read all of these books. And if you don't have the kind of education, if you haven't had someone all your life in fancy schools teaching you how to read hard novels, right? If you, for instance, went to college and studied a more practical degree because you were worried about how am I going to make money, then you might not really have the background to be able to understand what's going on in hard novels. You may not have developed the reading stamina to be able to get through them. And so as a result, you may do a lot of videos that are consumerism videos. They're videos about buying books and owning books and reorganizing your bookshelves, because those things don't actually require you to take the time to read and understand books. You can make those videos based on someone just shipping you books. And also, the books that you read, the kind of books that you read, may be not heavy, dense, hard to understand classics. They may be, fairy smut. And not only that, when you are trying to read enough books to churn out content and give the impression of being the kind of person who reads all these books, who has the time and money to read all these books, you may end up feeling like you need to get through more books than you are actually getting through. And as a result, not read all the books that you're talking about, or skim the books, skip chunks of the books, right? And I think it's interesting that the complaints that I often hear about the way that people are reading and the kind of books that they're reading in this anti-intellectualism conversation is either that they're reading poor quality books, or they're skimming, they're not really reading, they're skipping the dialogue or skipping long paragraphs, or that they're just buying books and not reading them. All three of those complaints can tie quite directly into a lack of time and education to actually be living the lifestyle that influencers are marketing to consumers. I know there was a really famous video of a woman who was complaining about how many words were on the page of a book, and she got a lot of online hate about having posted that opinion, right? And I have no particular feelings about this person. I think being an influencer, as long as you're relatively transparent about sort of the ads that you're doing and where the money is coming from, I think it's a perfectly legitimate marketing job to have. But I went ahead and looked at this woman's profile, and she seems fairly normal. She doesn't seem like she's a Nepo baby. She doesn't seem like she's coming from, huge inherited wealth. And as a result, may not have gotten a super fancy education, may not have just endless free time to spend reading books. And so I wouldn't be surprised if she is feeling some of these pressures as a result of the sort of squeeze of being in this middle tier in a product area where it is a more difficult gap to bridge than just getting sent free stuff from a brand. And I think that sort of consumerism squeeze is a significant factor in this perception people have of books becoming anti-intellectual. Because so much of the content that people consume about books on YouTube or Instagram is created by influencers who are doing this marketing job, and I think feeling this squeeze. But I don't know if I think it is reflective of the reading habits of the culture as a whole. I think that it may have more to do with the reading habits of the people that you and I, tend to see as representatives of the book community online. So that's the first phenomenon that I think is in play. And that is quite specific to book influencing. The other phenomenon that is at play, I think, is a much broader cultural phenomenon. And that is a very concerted devaluing of education and particularly literature by very powerful interest groups. Education used to serve a gatekeeping kind of role. Very few people could afford to get an education, only the mega rich. And education is a very powerful tool for self-advancement. And so the rich kind of ran society, and they had this basis for doing it, A, because they had all the money and all the power, but B, because they were the only educated ones. But in the past, century, education has started to become much more a tool for social mobility. Global literacy rates have absolutely skyrocketed. I mean, according to one study from the World Bank, global literacy in 1820 was around 10%, and global literacy by 2020 was around 80%. So that is a huge difference in the kinds of people from a class perspective who are getting an education and reading. And when education is primarily serving a gatekeeping function for the rich, obviously they have a motivation to value it highly. But as it starts to serve a social mobility function, people who maybe don't want social mobility start to have a motivation to devalue it. And beyond education specifically, literature itself is particularly powerful in its ability to create empathy for people who are different from the reader. And there's a really great clip of a conversation between Fran Lebowitz and Toni Morrison about the purposes of literature.
Because people have been taught to think of a book as a mirror instead of a door.
Exactly.
Or a window, like a way out.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why there are people who misunderstand you.
Novels fulfill this incredible dual function. One of allowing you as a person who might not have directly people around you telling you that you're valuable, right? Because of your race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, what have you. It allows you to see someone like you being treated with value. And also, it allows you as someone who might be living a life of, relative privilege, where you are mostly surrounded by other people like you, to have the experience of seeing someone unlike you treated as valuable and understand their experience. And both of those things are hugely important to a successful, functioning, multicultural democracy. When I think about this phenomenon, I always think about one of the opening passages in Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. Their family had more money, more horses, more slaves than anyone else in the county, but the boys had less grammar than most of their poor cracker neighbors. They had just been expelled from the University of Georgia, the fourth university that had thrown them out in 2 years. Stuart and Brent considered their latest expulsion a fine joke, and Scarlett, who had not willingly opened a book since leaving the Fayetteville Female Academy the year before, thought it just as amusing as they did. Now, obviously, this is a perspective being presented in a novel, a novel with a very clear propaganda purpose. But I think it is accurately describing an anti-education sensibility widely held among politicians, plantation owners in the antebellum South. And I think that anti-intellectual sentiment is common among groups of people, particularly powerful people, who are trying to justify colonizing, oppressing, generally mistreating other groups of people unlike them and their constituents. And I think that we see in popular culture right now a very concerted effort to devalue empathy and devalue literature as a purveyor of empathy. So in addition to the gender phenomenon that I think the book Leo did a great job exploring, there is, I think, a consumerism phenomenon in specifically the book influencing space, and an anti-intellectual, anti-education trend that is much broader in society. And the question then becomes, how bad is that? How much should we care? If we're talking about people reading for entertainment, I don't think it matters that much whether they're reading highbrow or lowbrow books. If people want to buy a book and read it but skip the dialogue because that's how they enjoy reading, that's kind of fine with me. I think people ought to be able to do things they're good at, do things they're bad at, do things in ways that are not the way that the thing is generally supposed to be done. In the same way that I would not judge someone who prefers a Frappuccino to really good quality coffee, or, you know, Trader Joe's $2 chuck to some sort of fancy wine, right? Ultimately, when it comes to matters of preference and enjoyment, you just like what you like, and that's fine. Now, we might be worried about the opportunity cost, right? If we think that people who otherwise would be reading Beth Wilkerson or Rachel Cusk are instead now reading fairy smut, we might think, wow, there was a real opportunity missed here for someone to expand their mind, educate themselves, learn, grow, whatever. But I sort of doubt that's what's really happening. I haven't seen this talked about so much in the novels space, but I know there's been a significant conversation happening in the poetry space about the pros and cons of sort of internet famous poetry. And one of the things that most of the articles I've read conclude is that internet poetry has driven a massive increase in overall poetry sales, but it doesn't appear to be cannibalizing sales of traditional poetry. So there aren't that many people who went to Barnes & Noble looking for Mary Oliver and came home with Ruby Kaur, right? Most of the people who were going to read Ruby Kaur's poems would otherwise have been doing something that wasn't reading poetry. And I suspect that a similar thing is true of fairy smut. I think that people who are spending a lazy Sunday afternoon on the couch reading fairy smut, if they weren't doing that, probably wouldn't be reading some heavy, deep book. They'd probably be listening to music or watching Netflix or doing something else that is taxing to a similar degree as reading fairy smut. So I don't have any stats to back this up. This is purely my own speculation. I suspect that there is not a huge opportunity cost for all of these people who are reading like unintellectual books. So ultimately, I think a lot of the angst around the idea of being a reader getting watered down by people reading unintellectual books or skimming books or, you know, listening to audiobooks and calling it reading or doing some other pursuit that people don't think of as like legitimately the right way to read is more to do with people who are reading books being concerned that their like brand value as a reader is being diluted by all these people out here reading fairy smut. And frankly, I don't think that that matters at all. I think that, you know, reading is a great hobby. It's an important skill. It is a tool for democracy and social mobility. But whether it stays like a status symbol, personally, I don't really care. But I do think the anti-intellectualism trend is dangerous insofar as it is perpetuating one aspect of a broader anti-intellectualism in our culture. The root causes of anti-intellectualism in the book community are not book community specific phenomena. And I don't think they have book community specific solutions. Instead, as with so many things, I think the real solution is tax billionaires and build libraries and fund schools and pay teachers. One of the natural consequences of funding schools and funding libraries and opening access to reading to more and more people from all different walks of life is inevitably going to be that reading loses its association with snobbery. But y'all, that's a good thing. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.